So good morning, everyone. My name is Vladimir Bosanac. Thank you for joining us today on this lovely Puget Sound typical weather. We are here to talk about the Puget Sound multifamily market, and we have a select group of folks who follow this every day and can tell us a little bit about what they are seeing and how we hope that the rest of the year and perhaps next year will evolve as we follow this market. So first of all, I want to say thank you to Lee and Associates for helping us put this web event together. I'm going to turn it over to Candice Chevalier, who is going to say a few words and introduce herself.
Thank you, Vlad. It's a pleasure to be here today. And yes, I'm with the Lee & Associates Commercial Real Estate Services Multifamily team, and we focus on the brokerage of apartment buildings here in our region. And we were talking about this a little bit before we started. There's so much information out there, and it's hard to know what is really the appropriate information to really be tracking. And so what better opportunity than to speak with some of our region thought leaders in our market about what's happening, about what's happened, and also about going forward. So, so thanks for the introduction, and look forward to a good conversation today.
Thanks, Candice. And I think by that you also meant don't listen to anybody else, listen to us. We are the authority on this subject.
Absolutely.
Great. All right. So just to make this a little bit dynamic, I would like everybody to say hello and introduce himself and herself. So Candice, we've heard from you. I'll go according to this slide. So Matthew, you want to say hi to everyone?
Thank you, Vlad. Good morning, everyone. Matthew Gardner, Chief Economist for Windermere Real Estate. Delighted to be joining this very auspicious group for the chat for this morning's discussion. So looking forward to it.
Thank you. James?
Hi, everyone. Good morning. My name is James McCafferty. I direct the Center for Economic and Business Research at Western Washington University.
Great. And Brian?
Hello, everybody. Brian O'Connor. I am both with the principal of O'Connor Consulting Group and a partner with Commercial Analytics, which provides apartment market data.
Great. And just for a little logistical point of view here, there is a Q&A section on everybody's screen. So I encourage everyone during the discussion to post some questions there, because a few times throughout the panel, we will look at those and try to weave them into the conversation also. So I encourage you to send us questions so that we can incorporate them. Candice, I'll turn it over to you from now.
Sounds great. And so just in terms of kind of how we've structured this event, we'll have James McCafferty start off with sort of a general economic forecast for nationally and for our region, and then have Matthew go into specific to housing in our region, and then finally have Brian go over apartment development rents and vacancy and some forecasting there. So so we'll start with James, and each speaker will speak for about 10 minutes, we'll have a couple questions, and then keep moving through, and then open it up for more of an audience Q&A towards the end. So take it away, James.
All right, first batter up. Okay, so let's just, doing a short talk is always kind of fun. So let's go to the first slide. So let's talk about summary. Let's just bring it right down. It's bad. All right, that's the short presentation. You give me a couple hours, I could extrapolate more on that, but it's bad. But there's hope, and it's getting better. But it might get bad again before it gets a lot better. So just know that that's the general shape of how we're looking at this. Next slide. So one of the things that we've heard is like, we're all in this together, and that's a great feeling, but it's not true. We're not all in the same boat. We're in the same storm. There's going to be significant winners and losers coming out of this, just like we saw out of 2008, just like we've seen out of any recession. There's always significant winners and losers. Some businesses and individuals have thrived. Some have treaded water. Some have taken on water. Some have and will sink. And some of this would have happened anyway. I mean, it sped up the process of businesses kind of going through an evolutionary process. It's been interesting to watch the statistics go through on what kind of businesses are struggling and where. There was an Economist article recently that talked about the 90% economy, and that's very true, that different industries are being affected in different ways. And so this picture here of this boat is probably one of my favorites to think about. If we all are in the same boat, well, some of us are bailing, some of us aren't. Next slide. So where are we? We have record unemployment, right? You guys saw the reports today, 1.5 million recorded there. We have civil unrest. Maybe you've seen that in the news. We have a rising number of confirmed cases. So if we look at Washington State, we have a number of counties that are actually rising, and a handful that are about the same, and a whole bunch that really have very few cases at all. And so again, when you talk about how do you digest the news, it depends on where you live. I mean, if you live in the Wenatchee area, you're hearing stories about, hey, things are getting a whole lot better. But if you live just a little bit further down the freeway in Yakima County, you are number 4 on the county list for the entire country this week for rising cases. So again, it depends on where you are, but we're seeing this across the entire country, and we're seeing globally a pretty sharp increase in the number of cases. And of course, this will keep moving around the earth until we find a way to contain it with a vaccine. Next slide. So why there's hope is that first we had this fear of going out, right? So we had closed stores that created a demand shock. People not going out caused a supply shock. So we had all kinds of shocks going through the economy. We've moved to this FOMO, this fear of missing out. And I kind of jokingly, if I was to use a Star Wars, it's the consumers strike back, right? The consumers have come back, but they've changed where and how, or ho, I guess on this slide. And so we've changed how that's working. And so when we think about the supply chain, we went from a supply chain that was directing a huge amount of its product into the wholesale channel to now it's almost all going into the retail channel. It's why we've seen potatoes being given away by the pound. It's why we've seen these kind of things happening. And so it's being driven by consumers wanting to have demand, but they've changed how they're going to do that. The big piece here is this is a disaster-based crisis, not an economic crisis, which is what we've seen in 2008. It's when people draw references to, oh, there's more people unemployed now than in the Great Depression. Those are economic crises. They take a long time to come out. With a faster recovery, we think of a V or a U-shaped type recovery. We try not to think about the W-shaped recoveries. And so I've given a couple examples here of some industries to help you drive home that V and U shapes. Netflix or Disney Plus are great examples of V-shaped recoveries. They had an initial shock, they dropped a little bit, and then they came roaring back and actually have seen record profits. Home Depot, Lowe's, that industry in general has had a U-shaped type recovery. They had an initial loss, of course, and then people decided, hey, I'm stuck at home. Let's paint. Let's buy new appliances. Right. It's been fun watching that data on what people are buying, because 2 weeks ago it was appliances. And then you have industries like, and we're picking on people, Royal Caribbean, right? Nice L-shaped recovery for them at this moment. Although there is some data showing that people are actually booking cruises, and I don't get that, but people are booking cruises. Next slide. So the structural changes are going to impact businesses and people, and the structural changes are really what has my eye more than anything else. What changes? In 2008, we saw massive structural changes in the economy. The economy coming out of the recovery worked different. And so things that we're really looking at are shopping behaviors. People are tending to buy more things online. They're Instacarting. They're changing how they're buying things. In humans, if we change our behavior for more than 60 days, those behaviors tend to stick. And we're above 60 days at this point. So we expect to see some structural changes around how people shop and how people want to live that way. Remote working and remote learning, same story there, right? We've seen stories, Twitter saying, don't come back to our offices ever. We're not going to do that anymore. Work from home. We're seeing universities say, you know what, let's teach online. Let's do these things differently. A lot of companies are experiencing better productivity with their remote workers, and they're having a real epiphany moment about, oh, maybe we should stay in this mode. I spoke with a company the other day. They said they're 4 years ahead in their project timelines because people are working at home and more productivity. Do I think they're an outlier? Oh yeah. But most companies are finding really a win-win on having people work from home. So these are going to have long-term impacts on the region's economy and where and when transactions happen, because it's going to change. If we have remote working, we're going to change where people live. We're going to change how people choose to live. And I won't talk any more about that because Matthew will jump in on that in a while. Next slide. So there's a lot of questions. When should we actually expect a vaccine? Some people say next year, at the beginning of the year, end of this year. Some people say it should be the year after that. I can tell you the normality, the emergent of normal will happen about 2 quarters after we have an actual vaccine. It's going to take us about 6 months to go from we have a vaccine to people are getting it and now we're actually seeing some piece of this. The reality is the coronavirus will be with us forever because not everyone's going to get the vaccine, right? I mean, even with polio, we still have a number of countries that have polio, despite the fact that we've been able to eradicate it from most countries. We're always going to have this. The question is, can we get us to a herd capacity where it doesn't matter as much? Can test and trace actually keep up? Can Western, can the UW, can we actually physically test all those students at a pace fast enough that we could track who went to what party to know who's been exposed down the road? So there's a lot of questions around testing and tracing around whether or not that's actually going to be scalable to any kind of what we think of as normal. Next slide. And I should say normal is a very moving definition. Normality always is emerging. So normal right now is different than it was 2 years ago, which was different than it was 2 years before that. So it always changes. So when we look at the national outlook, and so this is from Blue Chip, for people that are familiar with that, these are the most recent Blue Chip numbers. They're suggesting this is where math comes in, right? I want you guys all have 5th grade flashbacks with me. You have to take all these numbers, the GDP numbers, and divide them by 4 to look at what the change is actually for that quarter. These are annualized. And so, no, we're not going to see a 40% drop in GDP. You might see a 9%, right? It's math. And we, as Americans, we don't do math a lot. So just keep that in mind. So if we took all of this together, Blue Chip is forecasting around a -4% for real GDP for the year. We've been telling people it's going to be close to 0 one way or the other. But this number has continued to oscillate down towards these low negative numbers. And of course, unemployment, we've seen unemployment numbers shift, and the region and national numbers are going to look a little bit different for structural reasons. Employment, when you look at the whole country, looks different than, say, our own region. And so we expect to see those elevated unemployments again for another year and a half out from here. We expect to see those numbers. And then we're having the same discussions we had in 2008, which is, does the natural rate of unemployment look different coming out of this? Will we see a 6% normal unemployment versus a 4% or 5%? And so those are real conversations. And of course, inflation, the good news is overall things got cheaper in Q2, which is fascinating. And that has to do with supply chains recalibrating and adjusting themselves back from wholesale to retail. And so that's not expected to be a lasting impact. As you can see, we're going to go back up there. Unemployment's been interesting. So the Fed yesterday released theirs at 9.3%. You see Blue Chips here at 13. Chamorro is another one we look at. They're in between. Most of them are in the same range. We're a little puzzled how the Fed is the lowest on this, but we'll wait till we dig into that a little more with the people that we relate to with them on trying to understand how they got to be at the low end of the game this time around. Next slide. So this is from the Puget Sound Economic Forecaster, which we publish. So it comes out every quarter in a print format, and then we do monthly updates online. But you can see how we compare. So the bottom half of this table is the United States, and this is all coming out of Blue Chip. And then you have the Puget Sound region, which are the modeling we do here. You're going to see some changes between what Blue Chip's forecasting versus what we're going to suggest here for our own region, and that's just based on our employment base, right? It's the denominator in our 5th grade math equation changes, as well as the industry mix. We have a very different industry mix in our region than you might see in other places. So again, housing permits, we're expecting a pretty big drop in housing permits. Well, for a while you couldn't build anything. It's going to take a while to get that cleaned back up. Population growth is pretty stable. We stay pretty close to the normal population growth, and everything else kind of tracks from there. Next slide. All right, right on the button. I'm doing good here, Candace. So a couple things you might want to be interested. We use our social media feed to feed out about 6 or so articles every day that we read that we think are interesting. If it's an article we don't agree with, we'll generally post why we don't agree with the article. That makes it kind of fun. So we're a good fun source for your favorite social media habit to do. And of course, the Economic Forecaster website is also available with some information on it as well.
Thank you, James. I did have one quick kind of clarifying question. I think one of the things that a lot of our developers and investors are really interested in is jobs. I mean, I think, you know, that is the driver for so much of our industry. And was looking at your forecasts and saw that you're thinking for 2020 about a negative 7.2% on jobs, and then adjusting to 4% in 2021. And I wondered, nationally, it was going from 9.3% to about 10.7%. And I wondered if you expect the national employment numbers to outpace our region, or if I'd love for you to just kind of clarify the
So
difference between those numbers.
this is where our 5th grade math comes back in. So when you look at unemployment, it's not, you don't always use the same denominator. The denominator changes every month, right? So based
Right.
on the number of people that are employed and looking for work, et cetera. So that's a moving target. So it's always a change in kind of a percent. And so that here in the Northwest, we've had less job loss. So our climb out is going to look a lot less shallow because we have a lot less to go.
Got it.
Than you do nationally. And so the national numbers are going to look more extreme, but in reality, our numbers are better.
And that's sort of what I have seen is we tend to, with recessions, our market tends to be a last in, first out market. And certainly with everything sort of starting here with COVID, we were first in. The hope is first out. So perfect. Well, I would love to move forward to Matthew and hear about his perspective on housing and the economy therein.
Well, thank you, Candice. And just a couple of things to back up what James was saying. And by the way, I love the classic economist statement of "it's going to be bad," which I certainly respect. What's interesting about the situation we're in right now is the fact it is unprecedented. Normally, when you see an economic contraction, and America's had what 47 recessions in its history, we know what caused it. We know what the exogenous cause was. And in this instance, we didn't. The economy was in actually rather good shape in January and February, and we fell off a cliff. So it's actually more reminiscent, in my opinion, to how economists react before a war or when a war breaks out. I think that's kind of an analogy which I've been using a lot. But what's even more interesting here is that because we are in such uncertain times, we as consumers tend to become paralyzed. What do we do when we don't know what to do? We do nothing out of fear. And that's a problem for the economy because consumption is what drives our economy. Us going out buying things is roughly 70% of US growth. So if we're not going to do that, how is that going to prolong any contraction? And the only other thing I would say is on the unemployment, I love the 5th grade math. I follow what's called, I'm sure James does as well, the U6 unemployment number. It's a more robust way to look at unemployment. And in May, it was actually 21.2% in May. So that's a more real. Are we close to depression numbers of 25? We're getting darn close to it. And it wouldn't surprise me to see it kick up a little bit. But I'm digressing. So on to onwards and upwards. Vlad, if I could have the next slide, please. What I thought would be interesting to do is to actually think about the economy in terms of population, because we do require that for the economy to grow, for real estate development, certainly. And this is the way that the Washington OFM looks at it. Blue line births, interesting there, been fairly stable, although I was very curious about the uptick in babies come 2006 or 7. We had a recession. We should have been doing less. We were clearly doing more. And I wonder whether that is going to be the case going forward. We've been locked up at home, who knows? So anyway, if you subtract the 26,000 odd number of people die, that's interesting. It has been slowly trending up. That's more indicative of an aging population. You get your net, which is births minus deaths. So in essence, last year, about just over 20,000 people in the Tri-County area, which is what this looks at, over and above the year before. But if you could hit the next button, you'll see, okay, here we are. People moving here from somewhere else. Really quite remarkable. Starting as we came out of the recession, a considerable number of them coming from, unsurprisingly, Northern California. Moving out of the Bay Area. And in essence, they've been moving here for several years. In fact, longer for one reason: we are cheap. Might sound a bizarre thing to say. If you're coming out of San Francisco, whether you are renting an apartment or indeed owning a home, it's a 50% discount. And if you add into that the 50% discount on office space as well, it's unsurprising. However, it did peak in 2017 and has tailed off very significantly. And that is another, there's more curiousness about that as well. If you could go to the next slide. And this is what's been happening. It has not been a contraction certainly not in Pierce County. It's been increasing, modest declines in Snohomish, but look at King County. Why is this going on? We are pushing people further and further out because of affordability. And that's not just on the ownership side, obviously near and dear to my heart. It's in the income property, in the apartment world as well. And it's very classic. What happens is you have a job in King County. If you can't afford to live here, you jump in your car and you hit I-5, and historically you went north into Snohomish County. Well, even that's changed. 2 years ago, we actually started seeing less people doing that and more people jumping in their cars and going south into Pierce County. So it's been interesting to see how in essence, housing costs are pushing people further and further out. And I do believe that is going to be a concept which is going to continue, but not necessarily for the normalized reasons. So we'll talk about that momentarily. But it is interesting to see, again, if you talk about growth rates, we are pushing people further away. Next slide, please. So we talk about apartments in a forecast, and this is a very macro forecast I put together. In essence, for the three-county area, a bit more than 630,000 renter households. Over the next 5 years, I anticipate that to grow, and in an aggregate by 9%. If you hit your button again, it's going to bring up a surprise. And that is, this is going to be a demand. I expect demand for over 57,000 new apartment units in the next 5 years. What's interesting about that, and I know that Brian, I'm sure, will possibly talk about it a bit later on the pipeline report, we've got a lot of apartment development going on still. And what is interesting about that is that from 2000 through 2007, in essence, we were building a lot of condominiums and very few apartments. Development activity, in essence, froze through the Great Recession. And when it picked up again, what happened? Well, the World and his wife became an apartment developer, whether they knew, quite frankly, anything about it or not. And so we saw a massive push on apartments. And that is still, to a degree, the same today as it was several years ago. We just haven't seen an increase in the number of condominium units. So the emphasis, and I could talk about that for an hour, but I won't, is very much on apartments. So we are going to continue to see apartment demand going forward. And part of the reason is interesting. If you go to the next slide. And it is this, it's housing affordability. This is an index which we've been putting together at the Washington Center for Real Estate Studies, which I chair at UW since 1993. And this looks at housing affordability. So the share, basically you want to be above 100. Above 100, then a household making median income can afford to buy a median priced home. We are still modestly affordable in Pierce and Snohomish, but guess what? Not in King. Another reason which is pushing people further out. However, for people that work here and want to stay here, one of their issues is they'd like to buy, they cannot afford it. So they've almost become forced renters. I remember being in an argument, excuse me, with a real estate professor from Wharton back in 2010, whose opinion was, you know, this new generation of millennials, they're going to be perma renters. They're never going to want to buy. They're going to be mobile and they're going to shift around the place. I kind of fairly vocally disagreed with her, and I was right. They do want to buy, but in a lot of markets, the problem is that they just can't afford it. And so again, you are seeing demand for apartments as much as anything else, just driven by price. Next slide, please. And what is interesting about this is that, and this is the price that a builder, or not a builder, even just somebody selling their home, if it's going to be affordable for a household making median income, it would be at a price point above below $570,000. I'm not sure when any of you last looked on maybe Windermere's website for housing. The choice of housing below $570,000 is not that spectacular. But it's not just that. It certainly is easier further south, and again, reason explains the push further down. But if you think about it, a lot of renters are first-time buyers. Next slide, please. And the issue, as you'll see for first-time buyers, is this: it's not affordable anywhere. And quite frankly, it has never been affordable for a first-time buyer in King County. And because of that, as much as you might like to find or suggest or think rather, you've got this big, massive demographic of millennials, and they are huge in scale. Do they want to buy? Absolutely, yes. 70% of them do. However, more than that, about 72% think they cannot afford to buy a home or indeed save up for the mortgage. And in Seattle, what you're finding is, do you save up money for a down payment for a mortgage, or do you pay your rent? They have a hard time doing both. And because of that, we've seen significant rental rate growth, certainly in the urban sectors, which I'm sure Brian is going to talk about. And if you think about home buyers, next slide, please. A builder, or even just somebody selling a home, you'd have to sell it for below $355,000 to be affordable to a first-time buyer. I looked a week or so ago on listings in King County at below that price point. There were 40 homes. That's it. So choice is hardly there. And a builder naturally is not going to be building, or he cannot build to that price. So you're seeing developers build to the high-end luxury market, not the entry level or first-time move up. And in essence, when we think about apartments, for a lot of people, that is going to hold them in abeyance where they are. Next slide, please. So when I think about the world going forward, if you can hit one more. This is going to be interesting. I know that certainly James had mentioned it earlier on. Because of COVID-19 and indeed potentially because of civil unrest, will developers who have historically been ignoring the suburbs, ignoring the woody walk-ups that we used to see back in the day, quaint term for low-rise apartments, are we going to see more interest in that kind of product form? And it wouldn't surprise me if for no other reason, construction costs. Secondarily, renters. As James also mentioned, we know 1 in 3 jobs can be done from home. Are we going to find renters saying, I'm moving out of the city into the suburbs for 2 reasons? 1, I don't have to be close to my home, so close to my work rather. But secondarily, guess what? Rents are going to be significantly cheaper. So is that going to drive a push further out? Next one, please. I think when we talk about it, it's interesting because we've been talking about hiving and apartments and condos and living close and close proximity. Well, close proximity is perhaps the dodo now as we move forward. And because of that, are we going to see changes in the multifamily space, both ownership and rental? When I talk about changes, we have to start looking at enhanced HVAC systems, keyless, touchless entry systems. So these are all going to be remarkably expensive, but are we going to find developers suggesting, or even existing apartment owners, is it going to validate the kind of rents they're looking to get back to? But they're going to have to start making some changes. So it will be interesting to see if they are going to address those concerns or potentially lose tenants to more removed areas. Next slide, please. So the multifamily tax exemption program, I'm not going to talk about this for a couple of seconds. Unfortunately, there were 2 bills which were designed to extend and also enhance by incorporating existing units. Unfortunately, they died in Olympia earlier this year. There is one program, 2950, is still out there. If it happens, it's unlikely to happen until next year. But these things are going to be remarkably important because we know how expensive rents are. And from that, it's going to be very hard to create housing, which in essence is not exclusive and remarkably expensive. And the NFT program, I think, is a very good example of that. Next one, please. Yes, I'm sorry, it's going to happen. And it is. I've managed to, as a team, to manage to keep rent control out of committee with Frank Chop for years and years and years. However, it is going to come back. I'm a pseudo-academic, and because of that, I can cite about 5,000 papers that have been written that suggest that rent control is ridiculous, and it is. It is a failed concept. It does not work. However, it is going to come back again, and it will be brought up in Olympia again, likely, maybe not this fall, but certainly next spring. So do be prepared, because that is something which is going to come out. Finally, one more, please. Moratoria. Now, we know obviously the state has extended moratoria across Washington. That's one thing. However, I am looking very closely at the city of Seattle. And here's why I say that. We know we have state mandated moratoria in place. And we also know that the city of Seattle has extended it even further to take you until December 31. And guess what? Because of the no eviction clause, winter evictions, in essence, if you are a renter today, you can get away with not paying your rent until April of 2021. Get scared. So I'm sure Brian's going to talk about this because, in essence, the potential to make significant adjustments to the value of assets, of apartment assets, could be very significant because of this. So it will be interesting. I know a lot of renters have been paying, but again, I'm going to defer to Brian on that. However, I am going to watch this very closely because it is something which is a massive unknown. In all, will we get through this? I think we will. But it's a case of degree and how much pain are we prepared to take. We continue to move here. Last time we lost population, 1973. And because of that, there is going to be demand for housing, but how exclusive, how elite, and are we going to be pushing people further out? But the bottom line is, this is a healthcare crisis. It's not a housing crisis. And with that, I'll turn it back to Candace.
Thank you, Matthew. One question as you were talking through, I mean, certainly the legislative risk is it's actually been one of our primary concerns as we watch kind of the changes that have been day by day, week by week over the last few months with regard to eviction bans and regulation. What do you think going forward is maybe our biggest risk factor for the rent market with regard to that?
It's so remarkably expensive to develop. The bottom line is, if you look at all aspects of what it costs to build anything, an apartment, an office, or even a home, land, labor, materials, regulatory fees.
Yeah.
Land, we've run out. We're not going to be expanding our urban growth boundaries. We can look to potentially enhance the areas within them. Different topic on back, basically going back on the plan that's already in place in Oregon, started in Minneapolis. Labor, no one's getting into construction, pushing up labor costs. Material costs have settled a little bit. Do type 1 high-rise construction, remarkably expensive. And finally, my all-time favorite, regulatory fees. 31 cents of every dollar it costs to build a multifamily structure are regulatory fees. That's on average across the country. Over 30 cents of every dollar it costs. Now, you can't change land, very hard to. Labor, unlikely. Materials, softening, but not that much. You could change regulation, but the trouble is we're in a situation today whereby jurisdictions are seeing their budgets eviscerated. There is no way they're going to understand that. But the trouble is, it's a catch-22. If it becomes apartments or even ownership housing so expensive, then when a company is going to say, well, guess what? Spokane becomes viable, Boise becomes viable, Las Vegas becomes viable as an option. We need to be very careful about this.
Yeah. And that's just it, is that's what we've been seeing as well is, I sat on one of the council meetings and they were talking about, this eviction ban, and they, and also putting restrictions in place on payment plans and all of these different things. And it came to, well, we don't have the money to cover these rents. So I guess we'll just make the landlord or the housing provider do it. And what we are seeing also is a movement of interest in purchasing outside of the city of Seattle, specifically because of those regulatory issues. One more question, Matthew, and that's about sound transit as it relates to kind of budget shortfalls.
Yeah.
We have this huge initiative towards public transportation and moving people. And we've passed those measures, but now everything's changed from a financing standpoint. How do you see that in the future?
Well, as you mentioned, Candice, we were in good shape. Sound Transit had a $96 billion budget for the next 25 years of construction. It had money for surpluses, but the trouble is they're expecting a 23% drop in revenue. Now, they did get some more money from the Fed, which is good. So where I see it, and my understanding right now is Linwood, Redmond, Federal Way, okay. After that, no one has got quite frankly, a clue. They actually hit a credit ceiling now in 2028. But I think as much as anything else, looking outside the box, trajectory in ridership. Even if we do expand it, are we going to get back into buses and into trains?
Exactly. Yeah.
I mean, in Seattle right now, ridership on transit ridership is down 72% year over year. It hasn't come back at all. And so it will be interesting to see that on top of the work from home scenario. If you get the work from home, again, that plays with the dynamic as well. Because it's very easy to think, great, people can move further out, still get to their offices in a reasonable period of time. But how many are actually going to need that now? So the bottom line is, I think, said Federal Way, Redmond, Linwood, okay. After that, it's very, very uncertain.
Yeah. Yeah. No, there's so many dynamics moving at the moment. So I appreciate your thoughts on that. Let's move to Brian O'Connor, my partner also in commercial analytics, and we have some great information. I'd just like to mention that's a group here locally that's collecting information on rents and vacancies and development, and really, driving these sites, watching to see what's actually moving forward towards construction. There's also a national rent tracker that's starting to shows the beginnings of some issues. The last few months have been pretty strong. Tenants have been hanging in there for the most part and keeping up their end of the bargain. But we are starting to see some cracks in that ability to pay, and especially as we're looking forward to the federal unemployment money burning off at the end of July. There's some concerns around that. So with that, Brian.
Well, hello.
Hello.
First slide. Okay, Matthew, you brought up some really good issues I'd like to get into, but before I can get into some of that stuff, I've got to go through some of the data here. So this is a vacancy survey output by unit type. And I think what you'll find interesting is if you notice the studios and open ones have a higher vacancy rate than the ones and the twos and even the threes, which is not normal. Normally we've seen the cheaper units have lower vacancy rates. So I think probably some of this unemployment we're seeing is probably hitting the studio and open one market a little bit harder. But the overall rate still coming in at about 3.9. And if we compare that, if we go back to last fall, the overall vacancy rate was about 3.6. Then in December, it was 3.8. And now it's 3.9. So I'm looking at that going, well, it's obviously been relatively stable because we haven't really hit that point yet where, people are picking up and moving out. And that's one of the things that I talked to Matthew about the apartment demand numbers. When I talk to clients that are concerned about this, they're concerned that people are just going to leave their apartments and move out of state or move to Eastern Washington or something like that and work remotely. And that's going to lower our demand numbers. Okay. Next slide, please. So here, this is rent change. And this is measured from same store to same store. So we look at what did this unit type at the same complex, the same apartment building, what did it rent do? What did its rents do between last September and March? So it's not looking at the average rents, it's what actual buildings have done. And you can, if you kind of study this for a moment, I think your calibrated eyeball would be able to go, well, it looks like it's pretty flat. We don't have an overall rate on there, but the overall rent change, if you looked at this whole pattern here, the overall rent change was 1% from last fall to March. And that doesn't really capture the real economic hit. We probably won't see that until we do it next fall. We'll capture whatever happens through the summer here. But also, the unemployment benefits have been, let's say, strong enough. And with the COVID-19 and renters just hunkering down, we haven't seen a lot of turmoil move outs. I've talked to some leasing agents who say actually they thought they would have more turnover, so they leased units in advance, and then the people called up and said, I can't move because of COVID. So they were scrambling to find apartments for people. So it's kind of like that's more demand than they thought they were going to have, but that'll probably evaporate after things settle down a little bit. Next page. So now we're going to look at supply, and supply is fundamentally made up of what do we have that's in lease up right now that's unleased, and in conjunction, what do we know that's under construction? And then you can look at proposed. But I discount the proposed a bit because they're usually, to have a proposed building impact the market within a 2 or 2.5 year time frame, it just usually doesn't happen. They'd have to be starting construction like now. So when I'm looking at about 2 years, it's what's the unleased and what's under construction. So here you can see the number of units. This is as of December, but I believe our spring numbers are really close to about the same because we've had new buildings enter in. So roughly think of that about 1,900 units. Okay, next. So this is under construction and will be delivered in 2020. So obviously the east side's up to 3,000, and I can tell you historically over the last 4 or 5 years, the east side is usually only done about 1,800 to 2,000. So the east side is up. Pierce County is up. They're usually more like 1,500, and I'd say the concentration of those supplies are mostly in urban Tacoma. And then you look at Seattle, which is probably the one that's most interesting to everybody. This is the city of Seattle plus shoreline. So we're trying to capture that this side of the lake versus the east side of the lake. Now, of that 5,000 in supply, what we've been tracking, this is the pattern hasn't changed that much. The amount that is in our downtown core has been about 3,000. Sometimes this number's up as high as 6, and it's almost like downtown core is capturing about half of the supply that the whole Seattle market is doing. I should say something about Kitsap real quick. It's only 216, but we've been doing a lot of work over in Kitsap, and we are working on multiple apartment buildings now. So Kitsap is kind of hitting a little bit of a bump up in supply. And Matthew, I don't know if you follow it for single family, but there's a lot of subdivisions. We have probably worked on more single family subdivisions in Kitsap County than anywhere else, where they're bringing new homes on at Kitsap for about 450 to 550,000. Kind of depends on the house. So the apartment market in Kitsap is really starting to go. And there's the one thing I like about Kitsap market is its employment base is so different than everybody else's employment base, because it's the naval shipyards and the Navy is such an anchor that it really holds up that market. So let's add all these up. If you look at all these markets combined, plus what was in lease up but unleased, you're going to have a supply that's hitting 2020 of about 13,000 units. As of late February, I was not concerned about that at all because we were having demand. For these last 5 years, I've had measurable net demand numbers of maybe 8,500 to 10,000 units, kind of fluctuated around. So if we had a supply of 13,000 and our demand was 9 or 9,500, that's nothing to worry about. Now, the question is, what is demand going to be this year when we have 13,000 units? And what I usually tell people is, you got these new buildings opening up. They're going to lease those units one way or another. They're going to offer concessions. They're going to drop rents. They're going to give gift cards, which they're doing all that stuff. And we'll get to some of that later. And I call it, they're going to, if they need to, they're going to steal demand. So if you're the property across the street and you're sitting there happy at 95% occupancy, but the new guy across the street is offering these great concessions, if there's no real demand in the market or just a little, he's going to steal tenants away from you because he is going to fill that building. And that's where we're going to see rents fall, effective rents fall. What I've seen so far, it's all been concessions and gift cards, not too much lower rents. We'll see how tough the market gets if they actually drop face rents. So the thing to remember for 2020 is we're looking at a supply of about 13,000 units. And personally, I think the demand is probably only going to be about 2,500 or so for this year, net demand. Next slide. So now we're looking at the same thing, but we're looking at the supply in 2021. And of course, what jumps out to everybody is Seattle's number went up. It went up from roughly 5,000 to 7,000. So next year, we're going to have 2,000 more units likely delivered to the market. And when I say likely delivered, I'm trying to handicap this last 2 or 3 months when construction stopped. So there's some of what we thought was going to come online in June may not come online till August. So the supply numbers may skew a little bit. We're tracking that all the time, and it'll adjust as we get more data in. So here we sit looking at 2020. We're going to have 9,928 new units, and we're going to have some units that have completed construction in the fall of 20 that will still be trying to lease up. And if demand's down, there may be more of them than we think. So our real supply in 2021, instead of 9.9, might be 10.9 or 11. And again, what is demand going to be in 2021 when we have 10 or 11,000 new units hitting the market? If this year it's 15 or 2,000 units, I suspect in 21 it'll start to rebound and it might be to 5, but I don't think we're going to jump right up to 10. I know, Matthew, you had a demand number of 57,000 over 5 years. I would agree with that. I'm interested to hear what you think it is on a year-by-year basis. That's the trick, because it's about net migration. Matthew was right. You've got a natural increase that adds about 18 to 20,000 people a year, but what really drives an apartment market is in migration. And if you look back at other strong apartment market eras, especially like the late 80s, it's the same thing. It's California economy is pushing migrants into our area. And what do new people do, especially young people who usually move, they rent apartments. So we have to follow net migration very closely. Okay, next slide, please. So this is some more recent data that you might find interesting. This is a little study Commercial Analytics was taking on. It's just a small survey, so the sample size is only about 21,000 units, but we had to really drill into who was paying rents, Did they request a payment plan? Are they on strike? And also, I think it's interesting to point out, if you look at the column with the percent unpaid, the east side's the lowest, okay, at 1.1% unpaid, and then Snohomish, which is a little surprise to me, but okay. But look at the south end at 8%. That actually is what I would have guessed, because I think the people that have been hit hardest by this unemployment, that work in restaurants and the service sector kind of jobs that got hit the most, they're not tech workers, they're working from home, so that's Seattle and the east side. But those folks tend to live where rents are a little cheaper, down the south end, and they're the ones that are probably getting hit with the unemployment hardest, and it shows up. And then you look at Seattle at about 2.5%, you kind of go, okay. So the overall total was 4.2, Seattle's sort of in the middle, but the east and the east side has done well. It's so tech heavy, probably not that much unemployment on the east side. Next slide, please. So this is to show you the geographic pattern of this partial payments, either no payment or partial payment. So you can see a sort of geographic concentrations of where they're at. And you've got Tacoma, you've got the South End, Des Moines, Burien, Kent, and then of course, you got a little bit of a concentration in Seattle. If you zoom in on the Seattle one, you'll find out that the real concentrations in Seattle tended to be Capitol Hill, First Hill, and Beacon Hill. Not so much South Lake Union or Northgate. So it's, okay, next slide, please. And then we get into the concessions where, to me, it's sort of the real, where the rubber's hitting the road here. So first off, we had about 45% of the buildings not offering concessions, which in terms of units, that's about 30% of the units. But we think it was more meaningful to track it by buildings since it's being affected by that management company. So you've got the group that is actually offering 4 weeks free, $500 off, 2 weeks free, 1 week, and there's some other miscellaneous stuff in there like gift cards and stuff. That together, if you added those all up, represents about 18%. So you could say 45% of the buildings are not offering any concessions, and 18% are offering some type of concession, with about 8% of them offering relatively heavy concessions of 2 weeks free. I suspect through the summer and into the fall that this is going to pick up. I think the battle that we're going to see amongst apartment buildings is really going to be focused on concessions, because owners, property managers, they really don't want to drop those face rents, because then it's easy to quantify how it's lowering the value of their building. But if it's a concession, it's up front, those sort of burn off quicker. And a lot of times they don't tell the appraisers about that. So, it's a little game of trying to trick the appraiser. And, oh, look we got great face rents. They didn't tell us that they gave away 2 months free rent though. So that's the data. But I think the interesting part here is some of the things that Matthew was hitting on about net migration. And if you want to get a handle on where this market is likely heading, you have to get comfortable with what you believe is going to happen with that variable. Plus, you got people in place that, like I said, I have a lot of clients concerned that they're just going to pick up and move. They're going to say, I'm done. I'm going back home, giving up my apartment. I'm out of here. I had a discussion this morning before we came on about when do most of these unemployment benefits expire for a lot of these people? And I was being told that it would probably be September, October, unless there's an extension, and there very well could be an extension. But if it is September or October, then maybe that's where we start to see people leave their apartments and vacancy rates go up, and it'll affect the overall net demand number. So you have to follow jobs. If we're still creating tech jobs and we're still pulling people in from California, that's going to drive our economy. The question is, what's the volume of those people moving in? Are enough of them going to move in to keep our demand numbers up? And I think that's where this all comes down to: jobs and net migration. And now, when I did my forecast, I dropped my demand number down for this year to about 2,500. I like to hear what Matthew thinks about that. And when I cranked that into my model, I said, well, what is, based on the supply and that demand, and vacancy rate at the beginning of the year was about 3.7. So that's our starting point. Given the supply, given the demand, crank it through, and it said by the end of the year, vacancies, this was King Snohomish, might be 5.5 to 6%. I was a little pleasantly surprised it wasn't higher. And then when you carried it over into 2021, with this increased supply in 2021, that vacancy forecast went from 5.5 to 6. It raised up to about 6.5 to maybe 7. It might peak next spring at about 7%.
Which all things considered is not so bad. If we think of a market in equilibrium at 5%, if we can kind of maintain 7%, that's right. Probably not too bad.
Not too bad.
So, and you think, when do you think we might see concessions start to burn off? We're starting to just see the beginnings of that now, but when do you think we might see that burn off? And when do you think we might see rent growth in our market again?
Well, given what I just said, vacancies in the spring of 2021, it's maybe approaching 7%. That's got to burn that off. So the concessions will probably go through of most of 2021. And they usually pick up in the fall anyway, because your strongest renting season tends to be spring and summer. So I think there'll be concessions during that normally healthy time, and then we'll get into the fall and they'll probably have to continue them. So I don't probably think you're going to see concessions fall off till late 2021, and rent growth, any kind of real substantial rent growth, probably till 2022.
Yeah, that sounds about right. Let's see, Vlad, do you want to start taking some of the questions that have come in?
Yeah, well, we have a couple of minutes. We're almost we're at the top of the hour, but there were a couple of questions that, thank you all for actually being active and sort of responding to those. I don't know if the others in the audience have seen them, but there was one that was interesting that I thought we should bring up, because I've heard this question for the last decade. It basically started during the last recession and the TARP money that was being thrown in TARP 1 and TARP 2. And the continuous question was, when is inflation coming? And I heard people say, folks, inflation is coming, watch out for inflation. and it never came. And here we are again. Matthew, you responded to this question, but I'd love to hear what James and Matthew, you guys have to say about that.
All you, James.
I have to apologize, Vlad. I was reading this question from Steve about no inflation. Was that the question you were asking about?
Yes, that's
okay,
exactly
perfect.
it, right.
I just want to make sure I was on the same page,
yeah.
because I was reading Matthew's response. And the thing that Matthew doesn't mention in here is the savings rate has increased so dramatically in the United States, and that's actually one of the bigger reasons why we don't see inflation, is that people aren't using those dollars to spend them. They're actually paying down their, when we say savings, they're paying off Visa, they're paying off bills. Some of it's going in the proverbial piggy bank, but demand for goods hasn't increased that dramatically, which that reduces any kind of inflationary pressure.
I'll probably just again repeat what I said earlier on. That is, government debt is inflationary, household debt's deflationary. One can offset the other if you combine globalization. Thank the Amazon.com gods. I mean, bottom line is inflation has been remarkably stable in America since World War II. I mean, you had one spike in the 70s, but that was self-induced. It was Nixon getting you guys off the gold standard. So other than that, we've seen remarkably stable inflation for almost a generation now, irrespective of qualitative easing number. What's this? 9, 10, whatever it is.
Yeah. There was another question, Candace, and I'll maybe make this last question, and then if you want to close out any final thoughts. But there was another question around sort of the outer kind of layers of the Puget Sound region, and this specific question was around Kitsap County. But are we expecting to see apartment development now happening more broadly and widely, because the work from home policies likely are here to stay, irrespective of maybe what one company is deciding or not?
Maybe I should say, I'll say something about that. We have already started to see that. That was already happening, but I think it was happening for a different reason, because there was so much supply in the Seattle Metro Core, Seattle Bellevue, that the development community started looking out in more secondary and tertiary markets, which for years hadn't had any supply at all. We were doing our first study back a few years back in Bremerton, and we looked back and went, nothing's been built for about 20 years, so they had a lot of old inventory, a lot of pent-up demand for new products. So we've been seeing this trend in secondary and tertiary markets for the last 2 to 3 years. And I agree, that'll probably pick up.
One question that's coming out quite a bit is about office demand and how that relates to demand for in-city apartments versus, if people are working from home and kind of going out, how does that affect office demand, which then affects apartment demand?
Offices are going to be interesting and moving forward. The buildings that are able to morph or modify themselves into this distance capacity, right? That they're able to containerize people into working spaces. Entrances and exits are able to be reconfigured. The buildings that are able to reconfigure are going to be able to demand higher rents. The buildings that cannot are going to find themselves in trouble. And we could say some of that age of the building is going to be a proxy for some of that, although some of those older buildings have done massive retrofits that are going to lend themselves to being able to be reconfigured this way. Mm-hmm. It's interesting, it's a short-term problem, but it's going to drive long-term change. And so even though within two years or so, we won't be having these same conversations around this, people are going to expect different work environments. They're not going to be looking for the open office structures. They're not going to be looking for that as much. They're going to look for more spaces that are more contained. And then we'll have a fad again of open space. But we're gonna have a big pullback in that respect. And so buildings that can modify themselves are going to be able to demand much more in the market than buildings that can't.
I think the interesting thing also is the fact that we've been shrinking down the square footage per employee for the last couple of decades. So if you then combine that with the remote working, and therefore will be increasing square footage per employee, even though there'll be fewer employees, if you kind of track that math, then I think from a demand standpoint, it's going to be there. Because the fact we could get back up to that 250 square foot per employee, which is where we were back in the 90s, and not the 120 square foot per employee where we are today.
Yeah, and we're seeing, that also with apartments, and, we're talking about office and how people use office buildings and the layouts and all of that, but then you've also got the same elements happening on multifamily, right? Multifamily developers have been looking at how to make the units smaller and smaller and smaller, and now everyone's crammed in there all day for 2 months. So we're starting to see demand now on 2-bedroom units, larger units, places where people can work from home. And that's also been some of the questions that have come in. Brian, are you starting to see any changes in design as it relates to multifamily?
So far, it's just talk right now. It's
Yeah.
conversation among, some clients, developers, architects, nothing concrete. I only know of one building that has actually done a redesign. One proposed building did a redesign just for that purpose. But I want to say something about the linkage between apartment demand and office. I have studied that numerous times. The number of people that go into office does not explain apartment demand totally. It only explains maybe not even half. And one of the things that I have found over time is a lot of where people choose to live in apartments has to do with a lifestyle choice. They may work for Microsoft in Redmond, but they live on Capitol Hill. So it's not that tied together. So you could have less people in an office building, but those people are still somewhere. So I think what's interesting the next few years is I think apartment demand may shift around a little bit. That's going to be the interesting thing, because it's been pretty much in a very constant pattern. It really hasn't shifted. It's been very predictable. East Side versus Seattle versus the South End. I mean, those haven't changed much, but it can't explain it with just office demand. Never works.
Yeah, that's interesting. And Matthew, you were nodding a bunch. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, and I think in essence, it's going to be fascinating to see how this plays out over time. There's always going to be a lag between an event and how we see any tangible adjustment in development product type. And it's going to be a long one. And don't forget, this whole thing's only been going on for the last 12 weeks.
Yeah.
So it's still remarkably early. But at the same time, certainly from the single family perspective, without a doubt, you're seeing developers being far more cognizant about rethink. I mean, are we going to get back to the old 90s study in new homes, which we got away from? We got into the open plan concept. So I think apartments and ownership housing goes hand in hand in that respect. But it's just going to be in essence, what I expect to see is the average size of ownership housing units, new ones, increasing, whereas we'd seen them decreasing for the last several years.
Yeah, no, and you're right. It will be fascinating. I was on a panel of different folks on one of the UW real estate boards, and there was the thought that in the next, call it 6 to 9 months, all of this is going to be very intense. But if you look 3 years forward, we may have kind of forgotten about a lot of these sort of very urgent issues right now. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. Well, I know that we don't want to go too long over our time here. Really appreciate the thoughtful conversation. I feel like we just scratched the surface. So maybe another one sometime soon. But going forward, I mean, certainly, I think we would all agree that there's a bright future to our region. We have definitely some headwinds with regard to certainly coming out of this health crisis, coming out of the regulatory environment, and how our cities and state can afford to continue to offer the services that they want to be able to offer. And I would, make a plug for, our local economic thought leaders here. I mean, Matthew Gardner is such an amazing resource. James McCaffrey and his group in the Economic Puget Sound Forecaster is just such a great, insight on the local economy, right? We talk a lot about national news, but I love getting perspectives from people here locally. Brian and the research that Commercial Analytics is doing. Even on the advocacy side, local groups like the Rental Housing Association of Washington, Seattle for Growth. These are groups that are trying to advocate and speak with policy makers about what's happening in our market and make it, make it have that bright future that we know it can have. So just a plug there. And also thank you so much to Vlad for your work in coordinating this event today. I think it's been really valuable. We are having a kind of a part 2 where we start to really focus on the lending environment, discussing how buildings kind of in this new normal are going to be valued, how appraisers are going to be looking at it, brokers and buyers. So, we've talked about sort of the fundamentals of our economy, and now, really translating that into what does that mean for the value of our investment real estate here in this Puget Sound region for multifamily. So with that, thank you again to all of the panelists and to Vlad, and have a good afternoon.
Yeah, thank you, Candace.
Thank
and
you.
I'll just close off by saying that we will be announcing that second part today. It's going to be 2 weeks from now on the 25th. So look in your email for that, and we hope that you can join us. Matthew, Brian, James, thank you, and Candace and Lee and Associates, thank you guys also. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Take care, guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye,
Take
everybody.
care.